Before we get into today's episode, I just want to make a quick announcement. At the time of this episode's release, Minnesotans of all walks of life are still suffering at the hands of an occupation by ICE agents. Although DHS has publicly declared Operation Metro Surge to be over, ICE agents are still here in force and continue to stop, harass, and detain people regardless of their citizenship status. And even once the last agent is driven from the state, the financial repercussions of this surge will still be felt for a long time to come. The good news is Minnesotans are organized and activated, and there are many, many ways that you can help. We urge everyone listening to head to standwithminnesota.com. You can donate to dozens of grassroots organizations doing work on the ground, help pay rent for families who are affected, seek out legal training or advice, find ways to volunteer or direct actions to participate in, and so much more. So please head to standwithminnesota.com. No matter who you are, where you live, or what your resources are, there are ways that you can make a difference and help people right now. Once again, that's standwithminnesota.com.
The land of 10,000 lakes, federal occupation,
and loons.
This is
Minnesota Unknown.
Each episode, we'll take a deep dive into Minnesota's storied past, with a special emphasis on the surprising, the unusual, and little-known history hidden in plain sight. My name is Alex Weston.
I'm Josie Bergman.
I'm Hannah Norton.
And we are Minnesota Unknown. Welcome, listeners, to part 2 of our deep dive into the story of how Bdóte, the junction of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, went from being at the very center of Dakota land to becoming Fort Snelling. So, to recap, last time we talked about the relationship between the Dakota people and the land, and then we went on a whirlwind tour through several centuries of European powers making vast claims to sections of North America. We traced how, for European Americans, land was seen as a commodity that could be bought and sold, and how, by the early years of the United States, the official U.S. government policy was that land could only be added to the United States if purchased through formal treaties with indigenous nations, negotiated by properly authorized personnel. We left off that story in the year 1805, when a man named General James Wilkinson was secretly conspiring with disgraced former President Aaron Burr to sell most of the western United States to Spain. Ultimately, that conspiracy fell apart, but in the midst of it, General Wilkinson dispatched a young lieutenant named Zebulon Pike up the Mississippi River on a secret mission. And that is where we will resume the narrative. So James Wilkinson has given Pike the following orders. I'll read a little bit here from the orders themselves.
Okay.
Wilkinson writes, "Sir, having completed your equipments, you are to proceed up the Mississippi with all possible diligence, taking the following instructions for your general government, which are to yield to your discretion in all cases of exigency. You will please take the course of the river, and calculate distances by time, noting rivers, creeks, highlands, prairies, islands, rapids, shoals, mines, quarries, timber, water, soil, Indian villages, and settlements in a diary, to comprehend reflections on the winds and weather." And then it goes on and on like that for several paragraphs. Basically, all the orders add up to go out, explore, take notes, and when you meet Native Americans, tell them the Americans are here and be friends. Pretty much exactly what Lewis and Clark were also doing at that same time in the Missouri River. The orders then conclude, "I wish you a speedy, pleasant, and safe tour, and am, sir, with sentiments of respect and esteem, your obedient servant, James Wilkinson." But then he adds a postscript under the signature that reads, quote, "P.S. In addition to the preceding order, you will be pleased to obtain permission from the Indians who claimed the ground for the erection of military posts and trading houses at the mouth of the River St. Pierre, the Falls of St. Anthony, and every other critical point which may fall under your observation. These permissions to be granted in formal conferences, regularly recorded, and the ground marked off. J.W." So the part about getting permission to build a fort isn't actually in the main body of the letter, but in a postscript. Now, why does that matter? Because this letter, like all official military documents, was copied by a secretary and one of those copies sent to Washington for record-keeping purposes. And the postscript with the whole get a land for a fort is not in that version.
Oopsies.
The only reason we know about Wilkinson's postscript is that Pike saved his copy and later published it. So it seems that Wilkinson's doing everything he can to keep this bit off the official record. which makes sense if this little land deal was part of Wilkinson's scheme to sell part of North America to the Spanish. Now, we can't prove that's what's going on, but this adds weight to that theory. Also, and I can't stress this enough, neither Pike nor Wilkinson have the authority to negotiate treaties. Per the Constitution, only the president or agents explicitly authorized by the president have that authority. So Wilkinson's basically giving Pike an illegal order, but he's keeping that bit out of the official records. So the mission departs on August 9th, 1805. Pike writes in his journal, sailed from my encampment near St. Louis at 4:00 p.m. on Friday, 9th August, 1805, with 1 sergeant, 2 corporals, and 17 privates, in a keelboat, 70 feet long, provisioned for 4 months. And a keelboat is a big, flat-bottomed boat that goes upriver by pure muscle power. You have big, long poles, and you literally just push off the bottom of the river.
You know what they say?
Sounds unpleasant.
What do they say?
Flat-bottom boats make the rockin' world go round.
Yes. Well done. They later give up on the keelboat because it is such slow going. They stop at a Dakota village and trade for some canoes. And so they continue upriver, and they get some people who speak both Dakota and French to come along with them because he doesn't speak either Dakota or French.
Great.
So he's not going to get very far. They eventually get up to near the area of Bdóte by September 3rd. I'm going to read one of his entries here because I think it's kind of revealing and interesting. He says, met 2 pierogies of family Indians. That would be like canoes.
Not delicious little Polish dumplings?
Delicious little Polish dumplings. They at first asked Mr. Bdóte if we were at war or if we were going to war. Mr. Bdóte is one of the translators that he's picked up along the way. They asked Mr. Bdóte if we were at war or if we were going to war. I now experienced the good effect of having some person on board who could speak their language.
What?
For they presented me with 3 pairs of ducks and a quantity of venison sufficient for all our crew. One day, in return, I made them some trifling presents. Afterwards, I met 2 pierogies carrying some of the warriors spoken of on the 2nd instant. They kept at a great distance until spoken to by Mr. B. It's surprising what a dread the Indians in this quarter have of the Americans. I've often seen them go round islands to avoid meeting my boat. It appears to me evident that the traders have taken great pains to impress upon the minds of the savages the idea of our being a very vindictive, ferocious, and warlike people.
Maybe they're just being polite.
This impression was perhaps made with no good intention, but when they find that our conduct towards them is guided by magnanimity and justice, instead of operating in an injurious manner, it will have the effect to make them reverence at the same time they fear us.
This Zebulon Pike guy was he was too pure for this world, wasn't he?
He was too something for this world. I picked that quote because I think it reveals a lot about his mindset. For one thing, he sees that everyone he meets is suspicious of them until they actually start talking with him. Mm-hmm. And
I wonder why.
He blames the traitors. He thinks, these British traitors have poisoned their minds against us. Never mind the fact that by this point, there's been basically 15 years of continual warfare in the Ohio River Valley of pretty genocidal actions where the U.S. military is directly conquering by force lands from indigenous people. Now, those people that are in the Ohio River Valley, they're not the Dakota, but word travels.
So, yeah. So no wonder they're like, hey, you're coming up here in a big flat-bottom boat, but now a canoe. Are you going to war?
Hey, there's a bunch of you, and you probably all have guns and are wearing perhaps military uniforms. I wonder if that's anything.
Yep. But luckily, Pike has Bdóte, the interpreter, and as soon as they start talking and realize, okay, this isn't a war party, that's literally what the Dakota he meet ask. They say, are you here to fight us?
Yeah.
And as soon as they say
Which
no...
is, may I just say, nice of them to ask.
Nice of them to ask. And as soon as they say no, they give them tons of gift. They give all sorts of food to his people. And Pike's just kind of like, that's nice. He says, I gave them trifling presents, whatever that means. The giving of food to these strangers in your land, that's an opening bid to start a relationship. That's the way these kinship ties start, and it, of course, goes from there. But the giving of gifts and presents was incredibly important in Dakota culture, and Pike, that's just flying right over his head. It's not something he seems to track. It just seems natural that, of course, everywhere we go, they're going to give us stuff.
So I feel like this is one of the pitfalls where we see him not doing his research, because it's not like this is a new thing that's been going on. It seems like if he'd even talked to some people that lived in that area, they would have been able to tell him that.
Right. So presumably his French interpreters could have filled him in a little more on, the cultural lay of the land, the ways of the country.
Because like you said, this kind of meeting has been going on for centuries at this point.
But it doesn't seem like from his journal that he took the time or effort, and Pike would not be the last for whom that could be said.
He's kind of willfully oblivious.
Willfully oblivious. And it's also worth noting that all these communications, they're happening in two languages that Pike doesn't speak. Pike is recording his perception of what was said. We don't actually know what the real conversations were. And I think it's quite possible that there's all sorts of nuances that are being lost on both sides of that equation.
Sure.
Okay, so that's September 3rd. They continue forward and eventually reach Bdóte itself on September 21st. He writes, "We made our encampment on the northeast point of the Big Island, opposite the St. Peter's." So the St. Peter's is what they called the Minnesota River at that time. He writes, "I observed a white flag on shore today, and on landing, discovered it to be white silk. It was suspended over a scaffold on which were laid 4 dead bodies, 2 enclosed in boards and 2 in bark. They were wrapped up in blankets, which appeared to be quite new. They were the bodies, I was informed, of 2 Sioux women who had lived with 2 Frenchmen, 1 of their children and some other relatives, 2 of whom died at St. Peter's and 2 at the St. Croix, but were brought here to be deposited upon this scaffold together. This is the manner of the Sioux burial, when persons die a natural death. But when they are killed, they suffer them to lay unburied. This circumstance brought to my recollection the bones of a man that I found on the hills below the St. Croix, and the jawbone that I brought on board. He must have been killed on that spot."
Old
Oh,
bones
no.
So again, a lot to unpack here, and I highlighted this quote because again, it shows just the ultimate cultural indifference and obliviousness here.
Yeah.
So yes, this is a guy that finds human remains and is like, "I'm taking this." But
yeah, what a jerk.
yeah. But this tracks with everything we know about Dakota burials. Often, when people died of natural causes, they would be first put on a scaffold and kind of wrapped in something. And the wrapping and the scaffold prevents scavengers from going at it. But the idea is they stay there until the body is decomposed down to kind of a skeleton. And then often the bones are laid to rest beyond that. And these scaffolds were put at sites with extreme spiritual sacred significance. And so what he calls the Big Island, this is what on maps today is called Pike Island, but to the Dakota, it was Wetatonka. And as the Big Island right in the middle of this incredibly sacred area, Bdóte, this was one of several sites nearby with incredible spiritual significance.
So he took the bones onto the boat knowing that that was their practice?
That's unclear, but it seems that earlier he had found a jawbone somewhere and took it along with him.
Yikes.
Now, he's right that that jawbone, if it's just lying out, it could be someone who died in battle.
In the heat of battle, it's not always possible for the dead to be gathered up safely. Or maybe it's not possible to carry everyone away or give them the full burial rites. So it's true that war dead were sometimes given hasty battlefield burials that were pretty shallow because it's not safe to hang around. So that could be the case here, but we'll never know for sure.
Who knows?
Yikes.
Either way, maybe don't take someone's bones.
Yeah, to me, that shows that he's probably not talking closely even to his interpreters, because the interpreters that he has along with him are people who have lived in and amongst these cultures for a while. So they presumably would have been able to tell him a little bit.
Yeah, you definitely want to take advantage of that if you possibly can.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about him being like, well, I'm not going to ask anybody any questions, and I'm just going to keep doing my thing over here.
I think he already thinks in that term of like, there's a frontier and beyond it is just unexplored wilderness. And he thinks of himself as this heroic explorer, not realizing like, I am entering territory that's been a fluid intermixing of different peoples and culture for centuries.
Well, and the funny thing is, not only is he winding up crossing paths with native peoples who are probably thinking he's a bit of an idiot, he's crossing paths with other Europeans who are like, that's not how it works, buddy.
Yeah, exactly. But eventually, after setting up this camp, word gets out to the surrounding Dakota villages, and he has his interpreters tell them to gather the leaders here. He says, gather everybody, we're going to make a big deal. So the first meeting that he has happens on September 22nd, the next day. And I'm going to read verbatim from the journal, but what's worth noting is all of the Dakota leaders that he meets, he refers to them by a French translation of their name, because that's what he's hearing. So September 22nd, he writes, 3 hours after, the Petit Corbeau, at the head of his band, arrived with 150 warriors. They ascended the hill in the point between the Mississippi and St. Peter's and gave us a salute à la mode sauvage with balls. In other words, they fired muskets in the air. After which we settled the affairs for the council the next day. Mr. Fraser and myself took a bark canoe and went up to the village in order to see Mr. Cameron. These are different translators. We ascended the St. Peter's to the village and found his camp. He engaged to be at council the next day and promised to let me have his barge. The Sioux had recently marched on a war excursion, but hearing by express of my arrival, they returned to the land. We were treated very hospitably, and hallooed after to go into every lodge to eat. Returning to our camp about 11 o'clock and found the Sioux and my men peaceably encamped. So the Petit Corbeau, that means Little Crow. This is the grandfather of a Little Crow who will end up leading some of the Dakota during the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. But Little Crow, Petit Corbeau, that's his French nickname. But his Dakota name was Chitawakwamani,
which literally translates as hawk that hunts walking.
They'd been out on a war mission, apparently, and word gets out, and he assembles this large group to come meet him there. And so this is all very formal. They're going through pomp and ceremony. They know that this is a big meeting of some kind. And the next day, September 23rd, Pike writes, "Prepared for the council, which we commenced about 12 o'clock. I had a bower or shade made of my sails on the beach, into which only my gentlemen, the traders, and the chiefs entered. I then addressed them in a speech, which, though long and touching on many points, its principal object was the granting of land at this place, Falls of St. Anthony and St. Croix, and making peace with the Chippeways." That's the Ojibwe. I was replied to by Les Fils de Pichon, Le Petit Corbeau, and Le Régional Levé. They gave me the land required, about 100,000 acres, equal to $200,000, and promised me a safe passport for myself and any chiefs I might bring down, but spoke doubtfully with respect to the peace. I gave them presents to the amount of about $200, and as soon as the council was over, I allowed the traders to present them with some liquor, which, with what I gave myself, was equal to 60 gallons. In 1/2 hour, they were all embarked for their respective villages. The chiefs in council were the Petit Corbeau, Le Fils de Pinchon, Le Grand Partisan, Bé Original Levé, Le Demi-Douzain, Le Bécasson, Le Bif Quémoche, and We Ana Engagé. And of those that he names, only 2, Petit Corbeau and We Aga Engagé, actually signed an X on the treaty that he then later brought down to St. Louis.
Okay, so it's very clear to me a few things which confirm what you were saying earlier, which is they're definitely looking at this land in terms of how many dollar signs appear before me when I get it. So he's like, this much land, which equals this many dollars. And then he is very, it seems smug to point out that, and I only gave them something equal to about $200 and some liquor. So he's not concerned with a fair exchange. For sure.
No. In fact, he brags about how much he ripped them off in his letter that he then writes. So this is his private journal. He writes a letter to James Wilkinson that is sent down ahead of his return. And in it he says,
quote, "You will perceive that we have obtained about 100,000 acres for a song. You will be pleased to observe, General, that the second article relative to consideration is blank."
So he's bragging about how cheap he got this land for.
And I think something that you hear a lot is this is just the way things were done back then. But it seems like no. It seems like actually for quite a while there had been an exchange and land agreements that actually did have some manner of give and take and working for both parties. Obviously, there's unfairnesses in all deals, and everyone always is looking for the benefit to themselves. But it sounds like the French-Canadian fur trappers and the British fur trappers at least there had been some benefit for both sides, typically. And this seems very pointedly about how can we make it the best deal for ourselves and also take joy in making it the worst deal for them.
Oh, and after he lists the leaders, his journal entry for that day continues. He says, "It was somewhat difficult to get them to sign the grant, as they conceived their word of honor should be taken for the grant without any mark. But I convinced them it was not on their account but my own that I wished them to sign it."
Now, in a separate document, Pike records his whole speech. It seems likely he'd actually written it out ahead of time so that it could be translated first into French and then into Dakota. But here is what Pike wrote in English, quote, "Brothers, it is the wish of our government to establish military posts on the upper Mississippi at such places as may be thought expedient. I therefore wish you to grant the United States 9 miles square at St. Croix, and at this place, from a league below the confluence of St. Peter's and the Mississippi to a league above St. Anthony, extending 3 leagues on each side of the river. As we are a people who are accustomed to have all our acts written down, in order to have them handed down to our children, I have drawn up a form of an agreement which we will both sign in the presence of the traders now present. After we know the terms, we will fill it up, and have it read and interpreted to you. Brothers, Those posts are intended as a benefit to you. The old chiefs now present must see that their situation improves by communication with the whites. It is the intention of the United States to establish factories at those posts, in which the Indians may procure all their things at a cheaper and better rate than they do now, or than your traders can afford to sell them to you, as they are single men who come far in small boats. But your fathers are many and strong. They will come with a strong arm in large boats. There will also be chiefs here who can attend to the wants of their brothers, without your sending or going all the way to St. Louis. They will see the traders that go up your rivers, and know that they are good men. So then Pike goes on for a little bit about how he wants peace, and why the Dakota shouldn't fight the Ojibwe, and why they shouldn't trust the British. And then he concludes the speech by saying, "Brothers, I am told that hitherto the traders have made a practice of selling rum to you. All of you in your right senses must know that it is injurious and occasions quarrels, murders, etc. amongst yourselves. For this reason your father has thought proper to prohibit the traders from selling you any rum. Brothers, I now present you with some of your father's tobacco and other trifling things, as a memorandum of my goodwill. And before my departure I will give you some liquor to clear your throats." And that's the end of the speech. Basically, liquor's bad. Don't trust anyone who gives you liquor. By the way, here's some liquor.
Oh, boy.
Now, Pike talked about factories. What he means is government-run fur trading posts, where theoretically the Dakota would be able to purchase things at a wholesale price. This was actually part of Thomas Jefferson's Indian policy, and his intent was that it would cut out the influence of British traders, but more importantly, he wanted the tribes to become dependent on the U.S. government for trade, and that would be used in the future as leverage to force them to sell their land. Jefferson is pretty explicit that this policy should be to encourage native nations to rack up as much debt as possible, so that that debt can be used against them in the future. So that's what's in it for the U.S. But as far as what Pike is pitching here to the Dakota, he's basically saying, let us build some forts, and we'll make sure you have access to better stuff at a cheaper price. That's the exchange. Not, we'll pay you money, and now we own the land. It's, if you let us build a fort, we'll build a trading post where you can get cheaper stuff. Now, spoiler alert, they do eventually build the fort, but the trading post never happens. But that promise is quite likely why the two leaders signed the treaty in the first place.
Okay.
Now, let's point out a few things about this. As far as we know, Petit Corbeau and all the rest of the Dakota leaders there do not speak any English. They probably speak some French. And he has some interpreters there that speak some Dakota. But we don't know how fluent they are in Dakota. And we don't know how much French the Dakota know. What we do know is Pike doesn't speak any French or any Dakota. So Pike gives a big long speech in English. And then that's translated, and we will never know exactly how that was translated, and we'll never know how that was understood. We'll never know if his translators were good translators. We'll never know if they kind of had to change things or simplify things.
I would just be really happy to know that what was actually said in translation was
Blah, 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 blah,
just
blah,
nod
blah.
your heads. He's going to give you some gifts. We're all going to have a drink. Don't sign the paper.
On that notion of the drink, from 1791 onward, it had been against federal Indian policy to give alcohol to Native Americans.
So again,
Pike is violating the law.
Again, this is another thing that I have heard. Oh, that's just the way things were done back then. But again, I say, when you actually look at it, that's not the way things were done.
Or it was the way things were done, but there were people at the time saying we shouldn't be doing this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like the whole argument of they didn't know any better back then. And it's like, well, actually they did, because at the time there were critics of this to the point that there was a law against it.
Yes. Now, he does get 2 of the 7 leaders that are there. It's interesting that he didn't get all 7 of them to mark an X next to their name on a document that was written in English. And this goes down in history as the Treaty of 1805 or the Treaty of St. Peter's. And because it's kind of at the centerpiece, I'm going to read this whole thing. It's not particularly long, but this is the document on which the United States government would make its land claim down to the present day. So it says, whereas at a conference held between the United States of America and the Sioux Nation of Indians, Lieutenant Z.M. Pike of the Army of the United States and the chiefs and warriors of the said tribe have agreed to the following articles, which, when ratified and approved of by the proper authority, shall be binding on both parties. Article 1, that the Sioux Nation grants unto the United States for the purpose of the establishment of military posts 9 miles square at the mouth of the river St. Croix, also from below the confluence of the Mississippi and St. Peter's up the Mississippi to include the Falls of St. Anthony, extending 9 miles on each side of the river. That the Sioux Nation grants to the United States the full sovereignty and power over said districts, forever, without any let or hindrance whatsoever. Article 2, that in consideration of the above grants, the United States, and this part was left blank.
Well, yeah, you got to fill
That's
that
where
in
it was
later.
supposed to say how much we pay them. The United States promises to pay something.
Undetermined amount.
Article 3. The United States promises on their part to permit the Sioux to pass, repass, hunt, or make other uses of the said districts, as they have formerly done, without any other exception but those specified in Article 1st. In testimony hereof, we, the undersigned, have hereunto set our hands and seals at the mouth of the river St. Peter's on the 23rd day of September, 1805. And then it is signed by Zebulon Pike, First Lieutenant, and then Le Petit Corbeau and We Aga and Agage. Now, we will never know how these terms, so like, for example, it says, the Sioux Nation grants to the United States the full sovereignty and power over said districts. Now, how was sovereignty translated? How was grants translated? We will never know. But there's a few things that we can deduce from what we know about the whole situation. One is, it's almost 100% guaranteed that the Dakota who were there did not see this as a land sale. And one reason we know that is they had been approached about land sales before, and these are the sorts of decisions that in the Dakota culture required a broad consent from the leaders of all of the affected people.
Well, and we'd already talked about how it's the 7 council fires, so it would take a huge meeting.
Yes.
To confirm an actual sale.
And we know exactly what those huge meetings look like because later on the U.S. negotiates a whole series of formal treaties, which are land sales and are understood as such with the Dakota. And in each of them, you see the federal Indian agents who are actually authorized by the president to negotiate these things.
And not just some yahoo from Kentucky.
Yes. Continually frustrated that it's taking so long to gather everyone because the Dakota would not sign anything until every leader from every band was there.
I'm so sorry that they wanted to do it legally.
Yes. So we know that whatever they thought was happening here, it wouldn't have been a land sale. Now, we can infer a bit from later on because eventually the United States comes back and we get to hear from some of these same people later on tell what they thought happened. And before I get there, I'll briefly wrap up how the rest of Pike's journey goes. Because remember, his mission is also to he was sent to locate the source of the Mississippi. Was his other big
classic
mission.
thing that's had no controversy.
Yep. So they continue upriver. He's apparently oblivious that winter is coming. His men, the traders that are acting as interpreters that are with him, say, we're not going any further because winter's coming. And
he says, what?
He says, winter, I
says,
hardly
you
know
can
her.
Camp here being near where Little Falls is today. And so the bulk of his soldiers and the traders, they set up a little winter camp there. And Pike continues on with only 2 other guys in a canoe that then sinks. They're able to salvage their gunpowder and their tents.
Well, thank God for that.
And they lay out the gunpowder to try to dry it out. And
Yep, powder
it
likes to
explodes
be
in the night
lit.
and burns down their tents.
Oops.
And things just continue to go badly. But he eventually keeps stumbling north, eventually winters with some fur traders, eventually decides that Cass Lake is the source of the Mississippi. It's not, but
Far enough for me.
Wow,
like,
this guy
we did
is just nothing but wins.
And by the spring, he's making his way back downriver. So I picked a couple quotes from his journey back down in the spring that I think, again, reveal just a little bit of insight into the mind of Zebulon Pike. So this is when he's returning to St. Peter's, to Bdóte. April 11th. Although it snowed very hard, we brought over both boats and descended the river to the island at the entrance of the St. Peter's. I sent to the chiefs and informed them I had something to communicate with them. The Fils de Pinchon immediately waited on me and informed me that he would provide a place for the purpose. About sundown, Jay was sent for and introduced into the council house, where I found a great many chiefs of the Soussitongs, Gens de Filus, and Gens du Lac. The Yanktongs had not yet come down. They were all waiting for my arrival. There were about 100 lodges or 600 people. We were saluted on our crossing the river with ball as usual.
Can
The
you
council-
stop saying with ball, please? They saluted us
musket
with
ball.
balls.
They fired their muskets.
Ballin'.
The council house was 2 large lodges capable of containing 300 men. In the upper were 40 chiefs and as many pipes set against the poles. So he's this big gathering. And again, they are rolling out the red carpet for him, so to speak. This is all like what you do with a very distinguished visitor.
They're being awfully nice to this guy who barely stumbled here and blew up his own tent.
And what he asks is, I want all of your leaders to come down with me to St. Louis to formalize this treaty that we signed. And none of them agree.
Yes.
What?
Because they have brains.
Exactly.
Well, they got shit to do. They're not going to just travel for months with this Yahoo.
They're like, no thanks.
But
He might
again,
sink all of our canoes.
They have a big feast and things. And again, this is a way of establishing a relationship. This is a generosity.
I mean, for this guy,
Yeah.
it's a lot of generosity.
It's a lot
they're
of
being
generosity.
Really nice
Again, they are beyond giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Do you think they feel sorry for him? Because I don't, but I can see where they might.
I think it's like if a dignitary from some foreign country comes and dines at the White House or something, like they're greeting him as a representative of another nation, and they're trying to say, like, look, we don't need to fight. We can establish trade.
Yep.
We can. They're being polite.
They're being too good for him.
Mm-hmm.
So the next day, they're given all sorts of stuff and feasted and taken into these tents. Their red carpet, so to speak, is rolled out for them. And he's given a bunch of gifts of great value, including sugar, which was incredibly expensive. And in exchange, he gives him just 1 drink of whiskey. And the person that he gave apparently complained that he hadn't given him enough of a gift. And Pike says, I directed the interpreter to tell him that if I returned to the St. Peter's with the troops, I would settle that affair with him. So he's basically saying, like, don't make me bring the troops and fight you.
Okay.
So... And again, who knows what this interaction was, but he meets again with Little Crow, and Little Crow tries to smooth it over, being like, look, we don't want to fight. I want nothing but peace. Mm-hmm. Some of my guys are hotheads. Yeah. And there's so much that we'll never know about what this interaction actually was, except to say that it shows how utterly dense and out of his depth Pike is. He has no clue the cultures he's dealing with or what any of this really means.
He's not a good diplomat.
He's not. So... From there, he continues on down and eventually reaches General Wilkinson. And by this point, the Spanish conspiracy has fizzled out, and General Wilkinson is on trial along with Aaron Burr for potentially treasonous activities, but they get off on a technicality.
You mean Kentucky never became its own sovereign nation?
Kentucky never became its own sovereign nation.
Really?
And immediately, though, it seems like Wilkinson is still maybe courting the Spanish, because immediately he sends Pike on another expedition into what was definitely Spanish territory to explore the Southwest. And this is where he goes to New Mexico and Colorado, and he names a mountain Pike's Peak that's still called that. Oh. And he gets captured by the Spanish, who didn't know he was there. Oh my God. And they accuse him of being a spy, and eventually he gets released.
He's like, yes, I'm a spy for you.
It's a whole mess. And he continues to serve in the army, and he eventually is killed in the War of 1812. He's at a fort, and the powder magazine at that fort explodes, and he is crushed by a chunk of the wall that lands on him. So that is the end of Zebulon Pike.
So it's his second incident with almost blowing himself up with gunpowder.
Yes.
Second time's the charm.
So there's this piece of paper. Let's follow this piece of paper that Pike has signed. He's convinced he just bought 200,000 acres. He brings it back to Wilkinson. Wilkinson sends it to Thomas Jefferson and says, see, I'm not trying to be a traitor. I just bought us a bunch of land.
Would a traitor do this?
Yes.
Are you proud
But
of
again,
me, Dad?
Illegally and incorrectly steal land?
Yes. The Constitution is very clear that only the president or people authorized by the president can make treaties with other nations. And that's
who's this guy authorized by again?
He's authorized by a guy
future king of Kentucky.
To sell America to Spain.
The future king of the sovereign nation of Kentucky.
But because Jefferson had not authorized Pike to negotiate this treaty, this is not a valid treaty.
But
this
still,
should be a non-issue.
Still, Pike is coming up to him like, "Are you proud of me, Dad? I mean, Mr. President."
Yes, but he got him to sign a piece of paper.
Well, he got 2 out of 7.
2 out of 7 to sign a piece of paper.
And that is a huge win.
Yes.
You know what they say? Best 2 out of 7.
Best 2 out of 7. But as we've seen from the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson loves acquiring land for the United States and is willing to twist the Constitution or the interpretation thereof as needed. So Jefferson debates for a while what to do with this piece of paper. And he eventually recommends that Congress ratify it as a treaty. And there's a debate on the floor of the Senate, and they basically say that this isn't a valid treaty. And the matter is dropped until late in near the end of Jefferson's presidency, and after basically everyone in Congress had lost their reelection. So they're a lame duck Congress. They decide to ratify this treaty. And
so they have nothing to lose. And they're like, well, why not?
They have nothing to lose. And I think they're thinking like, we're going to do this so that we can say we accomplished something. Yes. So in 1808, the Senate ratifies the treaty. And in the part that Pike left blank, the part where payment would go, they wrote, "The United States shall, prior to taking possession thereof, pay to the Sioux $2,000, or deliver the value thereof in such goods and merchandise as they shall choose." Now, as part of the treaty process, the Senate has to ratify it, and then it is supposed to be proclaimed by the president as the final step. Basically, it's the equivalent of like signing a bill into law. So Congress passes it. The president signs it. Now it's a law. For a treaty, it's supposed to be negotiated by someone authorized to do so. It's supposed to be ratified by the Senate. It's supposed to then be sent back to the people who signed it. And then the president is supposed to proclaim it. And that's the final step. It's never sent back to the Dakota. And Jefferson never proclaims it. So this treaty, even though they fudged the rules to get it ratified, it never completed that final step. So theoretically, this treaty should not be a valid treaty.
And the truth is, probably would have been completely forgotten about if it hadn't been for the War of 1812.
Oops.
Now here's a quiz time. What's the War of 1812 about?
Whether or not it is 1811 anymore.
That's correct.
Nailed it!
No, it's a tough question because that's one we just breeze on by in history class. And if we do know anything about it, it's, the Star-Spangled Banner or Dolly Madison saving the painting of Washington in the White House. What the war was actually about? Well, here's the short version of it. Britain is busy fighting Napoleon, and they want to punish France. So they say, America, you cannot trade with France anymore. And when Americans keep doing it, they stop American ships. And the British say, if there's any former British subjects on here, we can impress them into the Navy because the Navy needs men. So they start basically kidnapping people and forcing them to fight in the Navy. And this understandably gets Americans quite mad.
You mean Americans don't like it when people are just kidnapped off the streets?
They don't. Or off of boats, as this case would be. Now, as it so happens, it was mostly northern sailors from ports like Boston that were being affected by this. But it was southern landowners that were saying, we should go to war over this. And actually, the New England states, who were most directly affected by the impressment of sailors, were saying, no, we shouldn't go to war. And actually, several states threatened to secede from the Union if we did go to war.
We do love a secession threat.
But it was a bunch of large landowners in places like Virginia who wanted to claim more land. And what they were saying is, if we declare war on Britain, we can march into Canada and claim that land.
Oh my God.
This was the scheme, is we are going to seize Canada. So, and
Canada.
This eventually goes through. It's the first time Congress declared war officially. We declare war on Britain and immediately send a bunch of troops into Canada thinking we'll be able to take it easy. We burn down York, which is today the city of Toronto, and then immediately get our butt kicked. And the Canadians and British march all the way back and burn down Washington, D.C. and burn the White House.
Oops.
And it's all a big mess. And in the end...
Canada burned the White House?
Yeah.
Hell yeah, Canada! Bring it back! Do it again! I dare you.
That seems like a stupid thing to not know.
Yeah.
And Alex agrees, clearly.
Yes. But in the end, there is no way the United States can continue to fight this war and win. But luckily for them, Britain really doesn't want to have to deal with this. They are busy fighting Napoleon. Like, they want to concentrate everything they can in Europe. So they sign a peace, and basically nothing is resolved. Canada is not conquered.
What?
The impressment of sailors
Not
continues. The British troops leave Washington. The American troops leave York.
But they
it basically
still...
is a draw. It's basically just back to the way things were before the war. But the big losers in the War of 1812 were many Native American tribes who were allied with the British. So the British, again, didn't want to have to send lots of troops to the United States. So they said to the various Native nations that they had relationships with, help us fight the Americans. And in this war, there are some Dakota that actually fight in battles against U.S. troops. And
the reason I say that Britain's native allies were the real losers of the war is that during the war, Britain had actually started promising that they would throw the full might of the British Empire behind establishing a permanent Indian country as a bulwark against future westward expansion by the United States. So the promise was basically, help us fight the Americans this time, and after that we'll make sure you never have to worry about them encroaching on your land ever again. And Britain just totally abandoned this promise and threw its native allies under the bus.
At the end of it, there is a peace negotiated in the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, and just like the many European treaties before that, there are no native representatives there. But because the British had called on indigenous allies in this, and because those alliances were there because of the fur trade, after the War of 1812, the War Department says, we need a series of forts along the riverways to kick out British fur traders. So we're looking for locations where we could have a good fort to monitor river traffic. And, oh, look, there's this piece of paper that says we own a piece of land right at the junction of these two crucial rivers.
Whatever cool cat got that sign.
It must have been a true genius.
And so in 1817 is when they officially say, yes, we're going to actually build a fort at this site. And in 1819, troops arrive at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota River, and they begin building what at first was called Fort St. Anthony, later renamed Fort Snelling, after one of the early commanding officers that helped design the final fort.
Do you think Pike was mad they didn't name it after him?
Well, he was dead, so...
Oh, all right, then who cares?
Now, what's interesting is, now that the United States arrives back, Little Crow, Chautauqua is still around, and they talk with him again. And it becomes very clear that he had expected that a fur trading post was going to be built here. He says, hey, why isn't there a fur trading post? You had promised me better prices on goods, and that's why we did the whole thing.
Listen, thank goodness someone was listening to the terms of that deal.
So that's the best we'll ever get at understanding what the Dakota understood they were getting out of putting their mark on this piece of paper. And meanwhile, the Army hands over the $2,000 that the Senate had authorized and says, yes, there will be a factory built here. Factory meant like a government-run trading post. And the idea is it's government-run, so you'll get a better deal on goods than you will from the private traders here. That never happens. But the Army does build a fort there and an Indian agency, and this becomes the focal point for future treaties, which are definitely understood on all sides to be land sales. But this initial treaty that covers the land that Fort Snelling is on and much of what's now the Twin Cities area, this initial treaty is technically still on the books, but is about as legally dubious as a treaty can get. And as early as the 1820s, you have Little Crow and other Dakota who were part of that 1805 deal expressing their disappointment with what's going on.
And we have, for example, this speech from Little Crow, Chautauqua, recorded by the Indian agent Lawrence Tolliver in 1829. He says,
"My father, I gave you the land on which your fort stands. If I had not been friendly disposed and wished the white people to settle near me, you would not have gotten an inch of ground from me." So again, there is an acknowledgement there that they allowed the fort to be built here. Why would they do that? Again, it probably has to do with that idea that they're going to get a fur trading post, which will give them good goods.
Which historically has been a pretty decent deal for them.
Yep. In similar interactions, Tolliver is told that the Dakota understood that the land the military was permitted to use was as far as can be seen around the fort without elevating the eyes. So that's
not
hardly
very far.
That's
Not
hardly 200,000
far at
acres.
all.
Basically, it's like what you can see here. Yeah, feel free to build a fort there.
Yeah.
The Dakota continually come and complain that the Army is taking too much, always emphasizing, we're okay that you're here. Mm-hmm. We just didn't think you'd be taking up all of this land as they continue to expand the military presence at the fort. Mm-hmm. But eventually they're forced into negotiations to sign a treaty in 1825 that actually specified boundaries between their territory and the Ojibwe. And then in 1837, they were coerced into actually ceding land on the east side of the Mississippi. And that's beyond the scope of this story we're telling, which is already rambling in every which direction. But the point is, we'll never know exactly what was understood, but it seems pretty clear they did not think they were selling the entire land. They were permitting the building of a fort on a relatively small area.
Like a trading post.
And then I think the thing that would have been very key to the Dakota that's in the formal document is Article 3. The United States promises on their part to permit the Sioux to pass, repass, hunt, or make other uses of said districts as they have formerly done. And probably in their understanding, however that was translating, it basically means, yeah, this is still our land. Because again,
that's what
in
ownership
Dakota
was.
Land ownership, it's less about the land itself as a commodity than who has the right to do what in this region.
Well, right. And like the wording of it implies, regardless of your idea of what owning land means, it permits them to use it as they have formerly done, meaning we're not planning to do anything here that's going to impact your use of it.
Yes. Now, spoiler alert, they do.
What?
As it goes forward, eventually, the military doesn't even bother mapping out or defining its military reservation until 1837. So they've been building a fort here since 1819. 1837, they draw the boundaries, and it's massive. And then from that point on, bit by bit, chunks of the military reservation in different bits of legislation and acts are sold off to private landowners. And what's interesting is, in some of these transactions, we later get lawsuits over the chain of title. And in the process of these lawsuits, we get lawyers actually examining these initial treaties. And pretty much every time this happens, they think that there's huge problems. So, for example, the island itself, that by this point had been named Pike Island, this had been given to fur trader Alexander Faribault, and then his parents purchased it, and they wanted to be reimbursed by the U.S. when the title to the island was taken by the federal government when they reclaimed part of it. And this lawsuit winds its way all the way to the U.S. Senate Military Affairs Committee in 1856. And after a long investigation, here is what they conclude. Quote, "It does appear that General Pike made an arrangement in 1805 with 2 Sioux Indians for the purchase of the lands of that tribe, including the Faribault Island, but there's no evidence that this agreement, to which there was not even a witness, and in which no consideration was named, was ever considered binding upon the Indians, or that they ever yielded up the possession of their lands under it. Certain it is that it was not ratified until 3 years afterwards, when the consideration of $2,000 was introduced into it, to which the other contracting parties never did assent. But it was never promulgated," meaning proclaimed by the president, "nor can it now be found upon the statute books, like any other treaty, if indeed a treaty it may be called, nor were its stipulations ever complied with on the part of the United States."
So they're saying it.
They're saying it's bunk.
It's not valid.
Now, did that stop the U.S. from claiming the land until this day? No.
But it is another, again, great point of like, yes, even back then, there were people saying...
There were problems.
Not just there were problems, but people were like, no, this is BS.
Yes. Now, to fast forward a bit, in the 1920s, University of Minnesota historian William Watts Falwell writes this massive 4-volume history of Minnesota. And here's what he writes about Pike's Treaty. "An ingenious critic has pointed out that this pretended conveyance is defective in the following respects. The parties concerned were incompetent, Pike not being an agent of the United States authorized to negotiate such a treaty, and these Indians being warriors of only one band, only of the Lower Sioux. The descriptions are hopelessly indefinite, no consideration is specified, no witnesses are named."
So he says, basically, hopeless and incompetent.
Yep. So after noting this ingenious criticism and basically saying all the reasons this is a bunk treaty, he then brushes it all aside with this sentence: "To these criticisms may be added another, namely, that the United States had no need to stipulate for sovereignty because it was already invested with that." In other words, we already own the land because of Louisiana Purchase, checkmate, which doesn't hold up.
If that's really true and that really was even the United States' understanding of it at the time, then why were people so hesitant to ratify it even at the time? That's ridiculous.
That is the $2,000 question.
I'm not surprised, but I'm still appalled, you know?
Yep. Now, we finally have to bring things to a close. Of course, Fort Snelling becomes one of the most pivotal locations in Minnesota history. It becomes really the sort of foothold that the United States has for negotiating future treaties. And by the time these future treaties are negotiated, the Dakota definitely understand what's going on. But By this point, they are deeply in debt. Partly as a matter of policy, the U.S. had been encouraging traders to extend credit even where it was bad business because they said, then we'll get them to sell their lands in order to pay the debts. And they basically been promising fur traders, when we sign over a land treaty, you'll get a bunch of money. And that's exactly what happened. So the fur traders, as the fur trade itself is collapsing, which had been really central to the Dakota way of life and economy at this point for 100 years or so, they are increasingly between a rock and a hard place. By this point, they've heard of how the Cherokee and other tribes have been forcibly removed. They're basically presented a choice of either you get something for this land or nothing. And the story of those treaties is intriguing and complex, and we should probably return to them at some point. But long story short, a series of treaties in 1825, 1837, and 1851 and 1858, the Dakota sign away more and more land. But they're heavily coerced to do so.
So the U.S. government leveraged the desperation of the fur traders, whose business was going bust, to leverage the native tribes to put them in debt and then push them to sign over their land to get money to pay off the debt.
Yes. That's a very simple boiling down of a very complex series of events, but that's basically it. Yes. Now, Fort Snelling, meanwhile, by the mid-1850s, this is now Minnesota territory on its way to becoming Minnesota state. There's a land rush here, and a lot of the people settling in the new towns of St. Paul and St. Anthony and Minneapolis are saying, what's all this good land doing there that we can't settle on? And there's incredible pressure to abandon the fort and open up the military reservation towards private land ownership. And at this point, there's only like 80 guys at the fort. There's no real reason to have a fort there anymore. You know, the fur trade is long gone. They're not patrolling the river for British fur traders anymore. They've already negotiated treaties with the Dakota. And there is a movement to get the U.S. to open up the land to public auction. But of course, politically well-connected people aren't going to allow that. A businessman named Franklin Steele, who was well connected in Washington and was the post-sutler. This is a civilian contractor that runs the store there. He does a bunch of backroom deals that gets the government to sell the entire military reservation to him personally for much less than it's worth. And then he starts subdividing it and selling it off. This is in 1858 when then that land sale goes through. And it's a huge scandal. It's pretty clear that this is insider dealing and Franklin Steele is getting a steal of a deal on this land that is now worth quite a lot. But before he can do much to actually sell off these plots of land, the U.S. Civil War breaks out. And suddenly we do need a fort. We need a place to muster all of the volunteer troops from Minnesota that are going to fight in the Civil War. And so the U.S. government buys the fort land back from Franklin Steele. So Steele benefits twice from it.
Hell yeah.
That's what you call
So
Mr. Real Estate.
Mr. Land.
So the fort is once again an active military fort, now largely as a training and mustering out base during the Civil War. But concurrent to the U.S. Civil War is the U.S. Dakota War. Basically, decades of broken promises and mounting tension and anger boil over in August of 1862, and a faction of Dakota begin attacking trading posts and settlements in southwest Minnesota. At most, maybe 400 or 500 Dakota participated in the attacks, but all 9,000 Dakota people who were on the reservation are then exiled as the Senate officially abrogates all former treaties with the Dakota, saying like, null and void, the Dakota are owed nothing. They're all set to be removed to reservations further west, except for around 200 quote-unquote friendly Indians. And the Dakota exile begins, and as part of this action of removing an entire people from their homeland, which meets modern UN definitions of genocide, about 1,700, mostly old men, women, and children, so non-combatants, are kept in a really cramped concentration camp below the fort during the winter of 1862 and 1863 before being loaded up onto steamboats. Around 300 die in the camp, mostly from measles and things, because the sanitary conditions are horrible. It's a sad truism of history that no matter what the intent, whenever you have people confined to a camp, it just never ends well. It's never a good situation. And people today who are protesting the detainment of people by ICE on these same lands, I think are not unfair to draw the historic parallels that this is also a place where people have been detained in the past by the U.S. government in ways that any common sense reading of justice would be appalled at.
And add to that for the Dakota and also now, I mean, some of the people being held there are Native peoples. This is, again, it's on a very sacred site.
It is.
For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So when people are making camps outside or across from Fort Snelling and trying to make a point about stolen land, and when people are outside the building protesting and talking about the historic precedent for things like this is what they're referring to.
Exactly. Now, to just give a thumbnail sketch of how we get from Fort Snelling Military Reservation to today's unorganized territory of Fort Snelling that we opened with. So the military, after buying it back from Franklin Steele, continues to maintain an active military base there up through 1946. It kind of grows and shrinks depending on the need. There's only a few people there during the 1870s when it's sort of a supply depot for missions further west. By World War I, it is known within the Army as the country club of the Army because it's just this posh place where there's like tennis courts and a movie theater and
Whiskey,
there's not
the
a
trick
lot going
horse.
on. There's
Oh,
whiskey,
great.
a trick horse. And then it swells massively during World War II because it becomes a major induction center for troops. It also becomes the place where a top secret military intelligence language school of Japanese Americans learning military terms in Japanese to serve as translators and interpreters in the war in the Pacific happen. And all of these are fascinating topics that probably eventually we should do a podcast on each of these things. The fort has a long and interesting history, but it is officially decommissioned as a military base in 1946. So then the question becomes what to do of this huge land that was military and now is just... ? So after the fort's decommissioned, there's this huge public debate what to do. The first huge chunk of land is given to become what is now MSP International Airport. So the airport is on the former military reservation. A huge part of it is given to the Department of Natural Resources and the state parks, and some of it's run by the Bureau of Mines, some by the DNR, and a big chunk of it down by the river itself, including the island, becomes part of Fort Snelling State Park. Meanwhile, the Minnesota Historical Society in 1965 takes over the original fort from the 1820s and begins restoring it. So if you visit it now, it looks the way it did in the 1820s. That's the result of massive construction and restoration. There were only 4 original buildings. Most of what you see there is modern construction made to look old. That diamond-shaped stone structure is what's run by the Minnesota Historical Society. Full disclosure, it is where I worked as an interpreter for 9 years, many years ago. But other land was retained by the federal government, and some of it became the land on which the Bishop Whipple Federal Building was built. And because this is under federal control, that has been where ICE has been stationed, and that is where they've been detaining people. And that is why Fort Snelling is once again in the news. So I'll close with the question that we opened with. Is the land that Fort Snelling's on stolen? Well, the U.S. government certainly would claim it's not. It's paid for fair and square. But I hope that wherever you land on this, you see that it's certainly a much more complicated story than that.
Actually, maybe the answer to that question is just, well, at the time, Congress thought so.
Yes, Congress thought so.
So.
It's dubious. So that's where we'll leave things. Thank you all for going on this crazy journey with us. We'll also have some cheerier and more fun topics coming soon. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into Minnesota's storied past. You can find detailed show notes for this and all episodes at minnesotaunknown.com/podcast. We'll post a link there to each episode along with features such as accompanying images, links to more info, and lists of sources cited. If you have questions, comments, corrections, complaints, or compliments, please email us at info@minnesotaunknown.com. We'd truly love to hear from you. Unless it's mean, and then I'll cry. You can find Minnesota Unknown wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe or follow so you don't miss an episode. And if you have a moment to rate and review, that would really help others find us. We also give history walking tours around the Twin Cities. To learn more about our current and upcoming tours, head to minnesotaunknown.com. Minnesota Unknown is produced, hosted, written, and researched by Hannah Norton, Josie Bergman, and Alex Weston. Our theme song is by Union Shakedown. This episode is copyright 2026 by Minnesota Unknown, LLC. All rights reserved.
So I was in 3rd grade. Field trip to historic Fort Snelling, which is the reconstructed 1820s version of the fort. And I was known to say Fort Snelling, more like fart smelling. And let me tell you, my popularity peaked that day at age 9.